The last real conversation I had with my mother took place in a hospital room that always smelled like a mix of antiseptic and the lavender lotion she insisted my dad bring from home. It ended with a promise. I said yes without thinking, like you do when someone is dying and asks for something, never wondering why it mattered to her so much. I'm Naomi Hendricks. I'm 34. For most of my adult life, I just understood something about my dad, the way you can feel a room is cold without anyone needing to say the words. Walter Hendricks didn't think women's opinions mattered much when it came to anything important. I have to be careful saying this, because it'd be easy to make him into some cartoon villain who yells and slams doors. That wasn't his style. His version of overlooking you was gentler, way quieter, and honestly, more complete. It added up over decades, the little choices and habits that always leaned the same direction, like a steady current in a river, never loud, but always steering everything around it. My dad built Hendricks Auto Group from one used car lot, turning it into 6 dealerships over 30 years. He was genuinely talented, the kind of man whose confidence stiffens into certainty with every success, especially about whose opinions counted. I worked for him for 6 years after my MBA, did real work, saw real results. I turned around 2 of our worst locations. I built a new financing program that boosted our margins better than anything the company had tried in a decade. Still, I never got invited into the rooms where it really mattered. But my younger brother Derek, with only a couple years drifting through college and way less experience, always had a seat. Dad liked to joke at dinner that a dealership needed someone who knew how to speak to other men. It was funny, except he was also telling you exactly what he meant. My mom, Carol, pushed back in her own way. Not arguments, no scenes. Everything happened quietly, in the background, never obvious, never what outsiders would call conflict. What most of the family, myself included, didn't understand for years was that she wasn't just sitting on the sidelines. Legally, she was part of the business in a way my dad had stopped noticing ages ago. When Hendricks Auto Group was first set up, the accountant put the land and buildings in a separate company for tax reasons, and Mom was made a 50% owner from day one. Dad never changed it. He just assumed, like he assumed most things about her, that she'd back him up on anything big. I think about that a lot now, honestly. How a person can spend 30 years standing right next to a piece of paper that says she owns half of something real and substantial, and her own husband still manages to act, every single day, like none of it counts for anything unless he decides it does. That's a particular kind of loneliness I don't think I ever fully understood until I watched my mother live inside it for as long as she did. She got diagnosed with ovarian cancer 18 months before she died. Those months were rougher than anything I'd known. Watching her grow smaller and more tired by the day while she quietly ran this hidden project alongside her treatment, something none of us, not me, not Derek, not Dad, knew anything about. I didn't find out the details until much later. All I saw during those months was Mom spending a lot of her energy meeting with a lawyer named Ms. Bennett. Someone brand new to our family, which at the time I figured was just for writing her will, doing all the paperwork people eventually need. No reason to think it was anything more complicated. But what I did see, as her illness got worse, was how sharply she watched my dad. Not suspicious or angry, but studying him, always asking about the company, Derek's role, what he pictured the place looking like in the future. To anyone else, it sounded like a wife just being supportive. Looking back, I see she was confirming what she'd likely already known for years, gathering the last pieces of something she'd probably suspected since long before her diagnosis ever forced her hand. There were small moments, too, that I only really understood much later. She asked my father once, almost casually over dinner, whether he ever thought about putting anything in writing for Derek before he actually needed to. My father waved the question off, said there was plenty of time for that, said he wasn't going anywhere yet, completely missing the way he always missed things involving her, that she wasn't really asking about him at all. She was asking about timing. She was asking how patient she needed to be. The day she made me promise came close to the end. The hospital room was half dark, full of the wrong kind of sunlight for the mood inside. She was thinner than I'd ever seen her. When she reached for my hand, her fingers were lighter than I thought was possible. She didn't talk about business, didn't mention money, the company, or any kind of plan. She just squeezed my hand and said, clear as anything, "I need you to promise me something, Naomi, something specific." "Anything," I said, because honestly, in a moment like that, you mean it. "When Derek gets engaged," she told me, "whenever it happens, as odd as the timing might feel, I need you there. Not just at the wedding, the engagement itself. I want you in the room the whole time, start to finish. Promise me that, not just in general. Promise it specifically." I gave her my word on the spot. I didn't ask why. It felt too cruel to question her then, and besides, I thought I understood. I figured she just wanted the family together. I assumed she wanted me to show up for my brother, the way she would have if she'd still been alive. It felt like something any mother would ask, facing the end. She died 6 weeks later, in March. The morning started like any other until it wasn't. Afterward, grief hit in waves, sometimes sharp, sometimes dull, never when I expected it. In line for groceries, in work meetings, late at night wanting to call her, forgetting she was gone. At the will reading, a few weeks later, Ms. Bennett gave me a message from Mom. It stuck in my head even though it didn't mean much to me at the time. She looked right at me, as if she meant every word, and said, "Your mother wanted you to know that if you're ever unsure why something matters, just be there and pay attention. In the moment, the reason will make itself clear." It sounded like something gentle, stitched together by grief, a mother telling her daughter to trust time. I nodded and let it go. Those weeks left no room for big puzzles. I had funeral arrangements to help with, a job I was barely managing to keep showing up for, a father who had started calling me at odd hours just to talk about nothing, which was its own strange kind of grief I didn't know what to do with either. None of us understood yet, least of all me, that Mom had spent the last year of her life constructing something much bigger than a will. She'd structured everything around a single, specific moment, something she was sure, after 3 decades with my dad, would eventually happen. Something set to unfold in front of people with all the performance my father couldn't resist. She built the whole thing and only asked for one thing from me. And she never explained why, because, I think, she knew some forms of protection only work when you don't realize they're there. Derek got engaged 5 months after Mom's funeral. It caught everyone a little off guard, but no one said so, even though grief still hung in the air, heavy as ever. The engagement party got scheduled for Saturday night in August at the country club Dad had belonged to forever. It was the kind of gathering that, in any other family, would just be a nice night. Cake, toasts, Priya's parents nervously smiling at our side of the family across overpriced champagne. Honestly, I almost skipped it. That promise to my mother had started feeling less like duty and more like a tired habit I couldn't quite bother to examine. 5 months of missing her had dulled any appetite I had for pretending to be a happy family. But a promise made to a dying woman doesn't get lighter just because you're drained. So I put on a good dress, showed up right on time, and walked into that glowing room of friends, relatives, and strangers. I had no idea I was about to find out exactly why my mother needed me there, all of it, every minute. I spent the first hour of Derek's engagement party missing my mother so hard it felt physical, like being tired but somehow sharper, a kind of ache. The country club ballroom glowed with candlelight, and the careful decor Priya's mother must have spent weeks arranging, the string light arches, the flowers everywhere, all of it striking just the right note. Every time something made me smile, I'd catch myself hoping I could look over and see my mom's face right there, only to remember all over again that she was gone. I had gotten used to that shot of grief, but it never failed to land exactly the same way every time, sharp and sudden, no matter how many months had passed since the funeral. For a while, I just kept myself busy, small talk with family members I hadn't seen in years, pretending I was as happy and present as everyone else. Priya's aunt asked me twice how I was holding up, in that careful sideways way people ask when they already suspect the honest answer might be too heavy for a party. I told her I was doing okay. I don't think either of us believed it, but it got us both through the conversation, without anything breaking open in the middle of the ballroom. But an odd sort of energy kept tugging my attention toward my father. He was in rare form that night, buzzing from group to group with the whole salesman charm turned up higher than usual. He kept dropping hints about a surprise tonight, gave Priya's parents the sort of sly nod that promised to show, and he pulled Derek aside twice, his hand heavy on Derek's shoulder, speaking urgently in low, private tones. Derek nodded along the way a son does when being ushered through some performance for the sake of tradition. Anyone else might have thought my father was just planning a big toast, but somewhere in the back of my mind I felt something winding up, some small, unplaceable tension I couldn't yet name. I remember catching my own reflection in one of the ballroom's mirrored panels at some point that evening and thinking, distantly, that I looked exactly like a woman attending an ordinary party, when something underneath my own skin had already started telling me this wasn't going to stay ordinary much longer. 9 o'clock. My father stood, glass raised. The conversations fell quiet, just the way they always did for the man at the top of the pyramid. He started in with the proud father bit, stories of Derek at age 6, little jokes that his longtime friends all knew by heart, the usual warmth, rehearsed, but as always, convincing enough to play in public. To be honest, my mind wandered. I tracked the line for cake, the music, anything except the endless performance at the front of the room. But then everything shifted. My father's voice, carrying with that certain force he only used when unveiling a new deal, cut through the room. "Everything I've built," he said, "everything passes to the next generation of Hendrix men. Starting tonight, the land underneath every single one of our dealerships belongs to you, son. All of it." He paused, and the silence was total, just for a moment. I felt it instantly, this whiplash clarity, like sliding glass panels finally snapping into place. In that second, Miss Bennett's words at the wheel reading surfaced, as if someone had whispered them in my ear. "If you're ever unsure why something matters, just be present and pay attention, and the reason will become obvious in the moment itself, not before." My mother had known. She'd known down to her bones exactly when and how he'd make this speech. And she'd needed me there not just for the sake of family photos. It wasn't just a sentimental request. She'd built a plan around this precise moment, this exact room, this exact sentence coming out of his mouth. A few days after the party, Miss Bennett laid everything out for me, concise and very real. My mother's trust held her half of the holding company, the piece that actually owned the dealership real estate, not the car lots themselves, but the ground beneath them. The trust named me as the sole beneficiary, not Derek, not a split between us, not my father. The trigger was any public announcement transferring assets or property to Derek in front of family and witnesses. The transfer required my presence to vest cleanly and without question. My mother knew exactly what she was doing. She was right about my father. He'd never make a move like that quietly, or by email. It had to be a big, unforgettable gesture. Because, with him, generosity was always a performance. She understood that so well, she built the plan to catch him on the very stage he'd choose for himself. No convincing required, no nudging needed. Just patience and an exact understanding of who he'd always been. I also understood now why my mother hadn't told me a single thing about it when she was alive. If I'd known, I'm sure I would have acted strangely at the party, watched him too closely, tipped off the man who spent his entire life reading a room. He'd have sensed the shift and never made his speech, never sprung the trap, and my mother's plan would have crumbled before it ever had the chance to work. The next morning, I drove to Ms. Bennett's office, running on less sleep than I'd admit, and replaying the whole event in my mind. She walked me through the paperwork. Every piece of it was careful, detailed. My mother's precision in crafting those documents almost made me laugh. Nothing sentimental, no grand statements. Just a set of triggers, signatures, and witness lines that worked like clockwork, the exact opposite of how she had ever spoken to any of us at the dinner table. It played out fast. My father's lawyer tried to finish the transfer of the property to Derek, the way my father had promised before the whole family and Priya's relatives. Except it was already mine, automatically and absolutely, the second those words passed my father's lips with me in the room. Decades-old operating agreements kicked in. For the company to sell, finance, or restructure anything, they now needed my consent as the majority co-owner. My father had stood there offering his son a gift, but only had half to give. The rest was now firmly in my hands. His reaction, not guilt, not reflection, just pure, bruised pride and rage, which he mostly sent toward my mother. He called it trickery, manipulation. Even after death, he raged about being betrayed by someone you're supposed to trust, as if he hadn't spent half a lifetime ignoring her value when it suited him. He didn't want to face that this elaborate plan was her way of shielding me from him, from the company, from that invisible current he'd always controlled. He called me a handful of times in those first weeks, his voice tight in a way I'd rarely heard from him, demanding to know how long I'd known, accusing me of being in on it from the start. I told him the truth, every time, that I'd known nothing until the exact moment he stood up with that champagne glass in his hand. I don't think he ever fully believed me. I think it was easier for him to imagine his daughter as a co-conspirator than to imagine his wife as someone capable of outmaneuvering him entirely on her own, using nothing but patience and 30 years of careful observation. That's the long and short of it. My mother spent her final year quietly building a protection she could never explain out loud. She asked only one thing, just be there and pay attention. She knew I'd figure it out when the moment came, not a second before, and she was right. The toughest conversation wasn't really with my father. It was Derek. He was the one who had to sit with this growing discomfort over the next few weeks, realizing the gift he'd been so excited about was never really my father's alone to give. That moment forced him to see that I had been quietly written out of our family's plans for years. He'd never noticed, and honestly, why would he? Noticing meant nothing for him. Until now. He called me twice before he finally came over in person, and both times on the phone I could hear him circling around the actual point without quite landing on it, asking instead about small, unrelated things, how I was doing, whether I needed anything, the kind of questions that are really just a way of postponing a harder one. About a month after that party, Derek showed up at my apartment. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, looking more uncertain than I've ever seen him, and really asked, what I wanted out of the company, out of the property, out of any of it. That was a first for us. It was always assumed Dad's plan spoke for both of us, and there was never a reason to question what I wanted, because nobody had ever needed my answer for anything that mattered before. I told him the truth, which was that I didn't fully know yet. That I'd spent so many years not being asked that question that I hadn't actually let myself sit with what I wanted underneath all the wanting to simply be included. He nodded slowly, like that answer cost him something to hear, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the two of us sat at that table, talking like equals instead of like a son who mattered and a daughter who was simply tolerated. In the end, I didn't take over the business. I didn't run my father out of the company he built from scratch. And it wasn't about revenge, never was. What I ended up with was steadier than a single big win. I finally had a real stake in the ground our family's wealth stood on. That just hadn't been possible for me before that night. And it happened not because of something clever I did, but because my mother understood my father better than anyone, even long after he'd stopped really seeing her. I think about that hospital room a lot, my mother holding my hand, her oddly specific request, letting me believe she just wanted something sentimental. She made it seem like she wanted family togetherness, a happy moment. In truth, she was setting the last part of a plan in motion, trusting me to be exactly where she needed, without ever explaining the real why. She knew some protections only work if you don't know you're being protected, at least, not until the understanding crashes in at exactly the right moment. If it comes too soon, it doesn't change anything. But if it comes when you need it, it changes everything.